It began with a storm, not of rain or wind, but of steel and fire. The Pacific roared, bombers screamed, and deep within the chaos of World War II, there arose an urgent, desperate question that no general, no architect, and no builder could easily answer. How do you shelter an army when the entire world is burning? The answer would come not from marble halls or engineering think tanks, but from a handful of minds locked away in cold workshops, sketching madly beneath flickering lamps, men and women who dared to design a structure that could survive anything the planet or humanity could throw at it. That structure would soon become one of the most recognizable silhouettes of the 20th century, the Quonset Hut. A building so strange, so impossibly simple, that even the soldiers who slept beneath its curved ribs of steel first laughed at it before realizing it was one of the most brilliant wartime inventions ever conceived. The story of the Quonset Hut doesn't start with victory, it starts with desperation. In 1941, as America stared into the jaws of war, the military faced a problem of logistics on a scale never seen before. They needed housing for millions of troops, workshops, hospitals, command posts, kitchens, and supply depots, and all of them had to be shipped halfway across the world. There was no time for brick and mortar. There was no room for lumbering construction. They needed something that could be built by anyone, anywhere, with almost nothing, a miracle made of metal. That's when engineers at the Naval Construction Battalion Center in Quonset Point, Rhode Island, were summoned. They were told, design a building that can go to war. The command was absurdly simple and impossibly complex. Within weeks, teams of engineers, draftsmen, and naval architects began experimenting with shapes that could resist both bombs and typhoons. They tested cubes, triangles, and flat roofs, all of which failed spectacularly. Then someone drew a half circle, an arc that curved like a wave, and everything changed. That curve, they realized, wasn't just elegant, it was indestructible. The arch distributes stress evenly, deflecting blast waves and high winds alike. When they rolled sheets of corrugated steel into that shape, the result was astonishing. Even with minimal framing, it stood firm against gusts that would rip apart traditional buildings. In test after test, it didn't crumble, it flexed, it didn't shatter, it swayed. The Quonset's beauty lay in its simplicity. A ribbed steel shell, bolted to wooden end walls, lined with insulation and covered with steel sheeting. The entire structure could be flat-packed, shipped in crates, and assembled by untrained men with only hammers and wrenches in a matter of hours. It wasn't just a building, it was an idea, a philosophy of survival. And when the first prototypes were erected, the military brass didn't smile. They marveled. The thing looked alien, curved, gleaming, and almost too light to be real. But when they saw it stand after simulated bombing tests, they knew they had created something extraordinary. Within months, the production lines at Quonset Point roared to life. Sheets of steel curved and clattered, rivets hissed, and trainloads of these half-cylindrical wonders began to roll toward the docks. Each hut, when packed, took up only a fraction of a cargo hold, yet one ship could carry enough to build an entire village overseas. From the deserts of North Africa to the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal, from the frozen Aleutians to the rolling fields of France, Quonset huts began to rise like metallic mushrooms after rain. They appeared wherever the U.S. military went, silent sentinels of progress, endurance, and sheer human ingenuity. And soon they became more than just shelters. Inside them, mechanics rebuilt engines by candlelight, surgeons performed operations as monsoon rains pounded the roof. Commanders drew lines on maps, knowing that the decisions made within those curved walls would shape the outcome of entire campaigns. Soldiers came to trust the Quonset's hum, the soft metallic song of rain against steel that meant safety, that meant home, if only for a night. But beneath its apparent simplicity, the hut's design concealed a genius level of thought. Its modular structure allowed extensions, heating systems, and even second layers of insulation for extreme climates. Engineers realized they could adapt it for nearly anything: hospitals, warehouses, mess halls, even chapels. And because its arched frame used less material than a traditional square building, it was cheaper, lighter, and faster to produce. In essence, it was the world's first true prefab revolution, decades before the term became fashionable. Yet, what really made the Quonset hut extraordinary wasn't just its construction, it was its soul. Soldiers from every corner of the globe lived, worked, and dreamed inside these curved shells. Letters home were written by candlelight beneath their roofs. Soldiers celebrated victories, mourned losses, and carved their names into the ribs of the walls. The hut became a silent witness to humanity's resilience amid destruction. When the war ended, the Quonset didn't die. It became a symbol of post-war rebirth. Surplus huts were sold for as little as $1,000, and across America, they were reborn as schools, diners, churches, factories, even family homes. Farmers turned them into barns, artists turned them into studios, and in every one of them, the same spirit endured, a reminder that what was built for war could also serve peace. Today, as the rain drums lightly on one of the few remaining original Quonset huts still standing, historians can't help but marvel at the audacity of it. Imagine a building designed to be temporary, still standing strong 8 decades later. It didn't just survive war, it transcended it. And here's the haunting twist: no one expected it to last. The engineers who designed it believed these huts would stand for 5 years at most. Yet, many still dot the landscapes of old airfields and small towns, their rusted spines glinting in the sun, monuments to a time when necessity forced humanity to invent something perfect. And as we end this first chapter of the Quonset story, one question lingers in the wind. If such strength can be born from desperation, what other forgotten inventions of war might still be quietly shaping our lives today? Because the Quonset hut was more than steel and bolts. It was the shape of survival itself. When the first Quonset hut left the Rhode Island factory floor and rolled toward the docks under a gray Atlantic sky, no one watching truly grasped what was about to happen. That these curved steel ribs, these simple corrugated arcs, would soon reshape not just the face of war, but the way humans thought about shelter itself. To understand the second chapter of this story, you have to imagine the impossible. The logistics of global war in 1942. The U.S. military was suddenly tasked with establishing bases in places so remote they barely appeared on maps. Volcanic. Islands in the Pacific, snow-choked Aleutian chains, disease-ridden jungles in Burma, scorching deserts in Africa. And each of these places demanded something different. A roof over a soldier's head, a depot for supplies, a workshop for machinery, and a command post for strategy. The problem? There was no infrastructure, nothing but mud, rock, and danger. Yet within months, the Quonset hut would become the miracle solution that conquered them all. Picture it: a cargo ship creaking into a makeshift harbor under heavy fire. Cranes swing wooden crates over the side, each stenciled Quonset Hut Kit, U.S. Navy property. Inside, everything needed for a building that could withstand bombs and typhoons. Pre-cut steel ribs, bolts, nuts, insulation, plywood, end frames, even nails and wrenches. There was no blueprint to follow, no expert supervision. And yet, by nightfall, exhausted soldiers and Seabees, the Navy's legendary construction battalions, had assembled the first gleaming half-cylinder under the flicker of lanterns. It looked alien against the jungle's edge, a silver moon lying on the earth. Within days, more huts followed, stretching in perfect rows, creating entire bases out of nothing but determination, sweat, and steel. Soldiers joked that you could ship 10 Quonsets in the time it took to ship one house, but beneath the humor was awe. Each hut took fewer than 12 men to assemble. No cranes, no cement, no training. You just laid out the base, bolted the arches, fastened the panels, and suddenly, shelter. And it wasn't just shelter. It was survival. Rain hammered on the roof, like artillery, yet the curved surface let it slide away harmlessly. When typhoons ripped through Pacific Islands, the Quonset Huts flexed but rarely fell. In the freezing cold, they trapped heat efficiently. In tropical heat, they vented through simple adjustable openings. The hut's geometry, that perfect half-circle, wasn't an accident. It was the result of physics, architecture, and desperation colliding. The engineers who designed it knew that in war, complexity fails, simplicity survives. A cube has corners that catch wind, edges that collapse under stress. But an arc endures. It distributes stress evenly. Every gust, every shock wave, every tremor flows harmlessly through its frame. And that's why Quonset Huts stood where others crumbled. But the story goes deeper, because soon these huts began to transform from military tools into emotional symbols. For the soldiers stationed thousands of miles from home, stepping inside a Quonset Hut was more than finding shade or warmth. It was a return to humanity. You could walk through a jungle thick with mosquitoes and death, hear the thunder of artillery beyond the horizon, and then step into a Quonset Hut and smell coffee, hear a gramophone playing, see men writing letters by lantern light. It became the beating heart of every temporary base, a place where camaraderie and exhaustion mixed in equal measure. Some soldiers even gave their huts names, painted nose art on the walls, or strung Christmas lights across their curved ceilings. These steel shells became homes, hospitals, chapels, and dreams, all rolled into one. Engineers soon realized they could modify the design for anything. Need a bakery? Add a chimney. Need a command post? Cut a window for a map room. Need to expand storage? Bolt on another segment. The modular design made the huts infinitely adaptable. There were even insulated Arctic Quonsets for the cold and ventilated tropical Quonsets for the heat. It was as if the design itself was alive, evolving alongside the war. And that evolution wasn't confined to blueprints. It was emotional, too. When you talk to the few surviving veterans today, they still remember the sound of rain on Quonset steel, a soft, rhythmic lullaby that drowned out the noise of chaos outside. In those moments under that curved roof, the war felt far away. But sometimes even the best engineering meets its test. In 1944, during one of the fiercest storms to ever hit the Pacific, a typhoon slammed into a forward U.S. base. Planes were tossed like toys. Palm trees were ripped from the ground. Yet when the storm cleared, the Quonset Huts were still standing, battered but unbroken. A military engineer reportedly said, "Everything else blew away, except those damn half-circles." That moment sealed the Quonset's reputation. From then on, it wasn't just a building. It was a fortress. It was proof that human ingenuity could defy even nature's rage. And while soldiers trusted the hut to keep them alive, the brass loved it for another reason: numbers. The cost was a fraction of any other structure. It took less manpower, less time, and less shipping space. For every one wooden barracks sent overseas, the Navy could send nearly 20 Quonset Huts. It was efficiency perfected. As the war expanded, production ramped up. At the peak, over 150,000 Quonset Huts rolled off assembly lines, their curved ribs destined for every corner of the earth. And with them came something invisible but powerful: the psychological message that America could adapt faster, build smarter, and endure longer. The huts became part of a new kind of warfare, the logistics war. The enemy might have more planes or men, but America had the means to build an empire overnight. And it did. Yet beneath the statistics, the story stayed human. Somewhere in the Pacific, a young radio operator sat inside a Quonset Hut during a bombing raid, clutching his headset as the roof above him trembled, and survived. Somewhere in North Africa, a mechanic worked under a single light bulb, rebuilding an engine that would fly the next morning. Somewhere in France, a wounded soldier opened his eyes to the curved ceiling of a Quonset hospital and thought, "I made it." That's what made the Quonset different. It wasn't just a structure. It was a promise. It said, "You're safe here. For now. And in war, that meant everything. As the world turned and the war raged on, the Quonset Hut became a silent ally, an unspoken hero, not glamorous like a tank or a plane, but infinitely more essential. Because when bombs stopped falling and the rain began, what soldiers remembered most wasn't the thunder outside. It was the comforting hum of a curved steel roof that never gave in. By 1943, as the war thundered on across every ocean and continent, the Quonset Hut wasn't just a building. It had become the backbone of an invisible empire stretching from the frozen Aleutians to the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal. But to understand how these humble arcs of steel and plywood reshaped the world, you have to step inside one, not as an engineer, but as a soldier waking to the echoing clang of boots on the metal floor, the soft hiss of rain above, and the faint glow of dawn sneaking through a tiny round window cut into the curved wall. The Quonset Hut was more than a shelter. It was a world within a world, a capsule of civilization surrounded by chaos. Every rivet, every bolt held stories, of laughter, of fear, of longing. Inside, life continued even as war raged outside. Pilots studied maps over makeshift tables made from ammunition crates. Medics sterilized instruments in coffee pots. Chaplains turned storage huts into sanctuaries where men knelt and whispered prayers under roofs that had survived air raids. The Quonset Hut was the one constant in a world that changed daily. The same curved ceiling followed a soldier from island to island, as if reminding him that home could be built anywhere. And while its design looked simple, it was anything but. The genius lay in how it blended mathematics, practicality, and psychology. That half-circle wasn't chosen at random. It was calculated to maximize strength with minimal material. Each rib shared the load evenly. The arch shape meant no single point bore stress alone. It could take hits, absorb shockwaves, and still stand firm. Even if the panels buckled, the structure would bend, not break. And yet it wasn't cold or sterile. The engineers had unknowingly built something deeply human, something that echoed the shape of old cathedrals, ancient domes, and even the sky itself. Soldiers later said sleeping in one felt strangely natural, as if being embraced by the earth. And in that comfort, morale soared. You can't measure morale on a blueprint, but commanders knew the truth. Soldiers fight better when they feel protected. That curved roof did more than shield them from bombs. It shielded them from despair. Still, not everyone saw the magic right away. Early critics in Washington had dismissed the design as a tin can experiment. They feared it was too flimsy, too strange-looking, too unmilitary. But those doubts evaporated the moment the huts hit the front lines. Reports poured in. Quonsets withstood typhoon. Quonsets survived bombing intact. Men alive, thanks to Quonset. By mid-1943, the Navy and Army were competing to order more. Entire divisions lived, worked, and healed inside them. Engineers modified the basic model into dozens of variants: A-type for storage, T-type for hospitals, N-type for tropical conditions, and K-type for freezing climates. They were painted in desert tan, jungle green, Arctic white, and sometimes even dazzle patterns to blend into the terrain. You could walk through a base and see an entire miniature city made of steel curves. Post office, barbershop, bakery, command center, chapel, movie theater. It was as if America had learned to mass-produce community. But perhaps the most striking transformation came in the Pacific, where the Quonset Hut became a literal line between life and death. The islands there were nightmares: mud, heat, disease, and relentless bombing. Yet every new landing saw Seabees unload those crates, drive stakes into the ground, and within hours, a skyline of shining arcs rose from the jungle. The Japanese called them silver eggs, baffled by how quickly they appeared. And they were right to be afraid, because wherever Quonset stood, airstrips followed. Fuel dumps, repair depots, radio stations, mess halls, all under those curved roofs, meant that America's reach extended further, faster, and stronger. The huts turned chaos into order, wilderness into infrastructure, and despair into momentum. That was their real power. They turned the impossible into routine. Even General MacArthur reportedly commented that the Quonset did more to win the Pacific than any weapon that fired a bullet. But there was a darker side, too. A quieter, heavier truth that settled in those metal corridors at night. Inside, soldiers would lie awake and hear the distant rumble of war. Artillery far away, waves crashing against the shore, rain drumming on the roof like gunfire. For many, that sound became the rhythm of survival. When bombs fell nearby, they'd feel the ground tremble, hear shrapnel ping off the walls, and then silence. The hut still stood. They'd take a breath and whisper, "She held." That faith, that psychological armor, kept them steady in a world tearing itself apart. And still, as ingenious as the huts were, no one back home could have predicted what would come next. That after the war, these temporary shelters would refuse to disappear. They had been designed to last months, maybe a year, but they survived for decades. After VJ Day, the world was littered with them, across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Refugees lived in them. Universities turned them into classrooms. Farmers used them as barns. Some became churches, art studios, and even homes. The Quonset Hut, born from war, had quietly become a symbol of resilience and renewal. Its curved silhouette came to represent humanity's ability to rebuild. But in 1943, no one could see that far ahead. For the men on the front lines, it was enough that the hut stood, defying bombs, storms, and despair. Late one night in the Solomon Islands, a storm rolled in. Rain like bullets, wind like whips. A young radio operator inside a Quonset felt the whole world shake. He braced for collapse, but the roof only moaned and flexed. When the storm passed, he stepped outside to find the jungle flattened, and the hut still gleaming in the moonlight, untouched. He later wrote home, "Everything else bent or broke. Not these. They're like they've got souls." That was the moment the myth of the Quonset Hut became legend, not because of its steel, but because of the people who trusted it with their lives. And as the war machine roared on, these curved sanctuaries kept multiplying, silently shaping victory one bolt, one arch, one storm at a time. By late 1944, the world had become a web of steel and shadows, and the humble Quonset Hut was its unseen thread. Every advance, every new base, every temporary outpost rising from nothing began the same way, with a curved rib, a panel of corrugated steel, and a hammer striking against destiny. From Normandy's beaches to Okinawa's shores, those half-moon shelters stood shoulder to shoulder with tanks, bombers, and rifles as tools of war. But unlike weapons they didn't destroy, they endured. The war planners back in Washington had envisioned them as disposable architecture, a stopgap before permanent bases could be built. What they couldn't predict was how their creation would outlast not only the war, but also the very empire it served. For the men who lived inside them, the Quonset wasn't an object, and it was a character. It creaked in the wind, sweated in the sun, and sang when the rain came. Its steel ribs groaned with every gust, but it held on, just like the men who depended on it. Pilots preparing for dawn missions would lean against the curved walls, feeling the cool metal hum under their backs, as if the hut itself shared their nerves. In the glow of single bare bulbs, they'd study maps covered in grease and dust, hearing the occasional drip of condensation fall from the roof like a clock ticking toward takeoff. The Quonset Hut became the quiet witness to the human condition at war. Laughter, fear, and faith all trapped within its echoing shell. In New Guinea, men built mess halls inside them, filling the space with cigarette smoke, radio crackle, and the sound of spoons clinking against tin plates. In Italy, wounded soldiers lay beneath their curved ceilings as nurses moved between rows of cots, whispering words softer than morphine. In Iceland, radar operators tracked enemy blips through endless nights, wrapped in blankets, their breaths fogging up the inside of the hut, frost forming on the metal ribs. Every corner of the globe told a new story, but the setting was the same, the Quonset. It was the universal home of the American war effort, a portable America that could unfold on any continent within hours. Its assembly was a dance, 24 men, a few crates, a handful of wrenches, and by sundown, the shape of survival rose from the mud. The brilliance of its design lay not in its complexity but in its humility. It didn't demand skilled labor or rare materials, just teamwork and time. Soldiers joked that the Quonset hut built itself if you stood still long enough. They could be stacked, shipped, reassembled, and repurposed infinitely. One became a church, another a barbershop, another a morgue. The line between war and life blurred inside those thin walls. Outside, bombs might fall, but inside, a soldier might be writing a letter, a nurse humming a lullaby, a chaplain conducting a wedding for two people who might not see another week. The contrast was haunting and beautiful, and still the huts kept evolving. Engineers learned that different climates demanded subtle adjustments: ventilation flaps for the tropics, insulation for the Arctic, sandbags for desert winds. They became living organisms, adapting to their environments like steel-skinned creatures of war. Some huts even survived direct hits, bent, scarred, but still standing. Men began to believe they were lucky. One lieutenant in the Philippines wrote in his diary, "They say angels guard men. I think one guards this hut." As the war turned in the Allies' favor, the Quonsets marched forward with them, from staging points to victory camps, from bloodied front lines to liberated cities. When the war finally neared its end, a strange melancholy spread among the men who lived beneath those arches. They realized that when they left, the huts would remain, silent, empty shells holding the echoes of everything they'd lived through. Some even carved their names into the walls, scrawled messages like, "We were here, 1944. Decades later, archaeologists and historians would find those etchings, crude graffiti turned sacred relics of endurance. But perhaps the most extraordinary chapter of the Quonset story began after the guns fell silent. In the ashes of Europe and Asia, millions were homeless. Cities lay in ruin, and suddenly, the same huts that had once housed soldiers now sheltered civilians. Refugees slept under those same steel curves, grateful for the warmth once given to warriors. In Britain, they became housing for bombed-out families. In the Philippines, classrooms. In the U.S., veterans returning home found themselves living once again inside the shape that had saved them overseas. Only now their wives and newborns were there too. The war's most practical invention had become a bridge between destruction and renewal. The curved roof that had once reflected the roar of artillery now echoed with children's laughter. The paradox was profound, a weaponless weapon that conquered both war and peace. In time, architects would study it as a masterpiece of form-meeting function, an object that balanced economy, strength, and spirit. But for those who had lived through its prime, it was never about design. It was about what it represented: hope made tangible, survival given shape. And even today, scattered across the world, rusting in jungles or shining on college campuses, the Quonset hut still stands as a ghost of an era when humanity built something simple and found it indestructible. In the eyes of history, the Quonset was never glamorous. It had no wings, no guns, no glory. But maybe that's why it lasted. Because in a world obsessed with destruction, the Quonset chose to endure. When the war's dust began to settle, the world found itself standing among ruins and ghosts. But scattered between those ruins, half buried in mud and overgrown grass, were the strange silhouettes of curved steel huts that had refused to die. The Quonset huts had outlasted the thunder of artillery, the roar of engines, the chaos of men. And now, in the eerie calm that followed, they stood as the first true shelters of peace. To understand their quiet heroism, you have to picture the world in 1945, cities shattered like broken glass, millions displaced, families with nothing but the clothes on their backs, children wandering roads that once carried armies. And yet, from the ashes of empire, from the debris of an industrial war, came these humble half-cylinders of corrugated steel that became the bones of civilization's rebirth. They weren't monuments or marvels. They were miracles of necessity, reborn from the same hands that had wielded wrenches and rifles. It began in the ports of Antwerp, Naples, and Manila, where thousands of unused Quonset kits sat stacked in forgotten warehouses. A U.S. engineer named Captain Charles Peterson once said, "We thought we built shelters for soldiers. Turns out we built shelters for the world." Those crates, stamped U.S. Navy property, were soon pried open by desperate civilians. Panels that had once shielded GIs from mortar fire now became walls against rain and hunger. In war-torn Europe, Quonsets sprouted in empty fields like metallic mushrooms. Refugees from Poland, Italy, and France called them the homes that the war forgot to destroy. They were crude, cold, and loud when the wind howled, but they stood when nothing else did. Each one built became a small rebellion against despair. Women hung curtains from steel arches. Children drew chalk pictures on the floors made of salvaged planks. Priests held mass inside them. Doctors stitched wounds. Teachers taught alphabets to children who had never known peace. And in those moments, the Quonset became more than shelter. It became redemption in architecture. America had exported not just weapons, but a design that could heal. Even as the U.S. military began dismantling bases across the Pacific, it kept hearing requests from devastated nations. Send us more huts. Soon, cargo ships that once carried tanks and bombs were now filled with Quonset kits, repurposed, reborn, redefined. In Japan, thousands were used to house displaced civilians after the atomic bombings. In the Philippines, they became schools. In England, where bomb damage had left whole neighborhoods gutted, returning soldiers moved their new brides into converted Quonsets, their laughter echoing in the same steel shells that had once echoed gunfire. There was a poetry to it. The instruments of war turned into instruments of healing. And still, the Quonset's genius kept proving itself. Its arch design could withstand typhoons, monsoons, even earthquakes. In one story from Guam, a massive storm flattened everything in sight, palm trees, jeeps, even hangars. But the line of Quonset huts stood firm. The soldiers returned after the storm, their faces pale with disbelief. One reportedly said, "Guess we built them too good." In another tale from Okinawa, a hut took a direct hit from a bomb that failed to detonate, leaving a crater right beside it, but the hut remained intact. Its metal bent inward like a scar, but still standing. It became a legend among the engineers, a symbol of resilience too stubborn to fail. Meanwhile, back in America, universities, factories, and towns began snapping up the surplus Quonsets. The GI Bill flooded campuses with veterans hungry for education, and the colleges scrambled to make room. The answer? Quonset classrooms. In New York, one student joked that he learned calculus under a roof that used to sleep a colonel. In Los Angeles, art students painted murals on their curved walls. The war's architecture had become the architecture of progress. Everywhere they appeared, Quonsets adapted. Farmers turned them into barns, fishermen into boat sheds, scientists into labs. Even NASA, decades later, would use modified Quonset structures at early test sites. What started as a military stopgap had turned into a global blueprint for survival. But behind every piece of corrugated steel was something deeper, the human instinct to rebuild. The Quonset was never just metal. It was memory. Each one carried the ghosts of the men who'd hammered it together in some distant jungle, the sweat that had sealed its bolts, the laughter that had echoed beneath its roof in a world gone mad. To stand inside one decades later was to feel that history pressing through the steel, the echo of 1,000 untold stories humming in the metal. And that's where the real miracle lies. Because the Quonset wasn't designed to last 80 years, yet here we are, and it's still standing. From Alaska to Africa, from the Pacific Islands to American farmland, those simple, unassuming arcs of steel still endure. Some are rusted relics swallowed by vines. Others gleam with fresh paint, reborn as workshops, homes, and studios. They've survived hurricanes, floods, and neglect because they were built on a truth far stronger than steel, that even in the darkest times, humanity builds not just to fight, but to live. And perhaps that's why the Quonset story still matters today. In a world once again tested by disaster, division, and uncertainty, we can look back at those curved roofs and remember, strength isn't always loud or grand or beautiful. Sometimes it's a quiet shape in the rain, still standing long after the storm has passed. As the sun sets on the story of the Quonset Hut, its curved shadow stretches across decades, continents, and generations, a silent witness to the triumph and tragedy of the human race. It began as a desperate wartime necessity, a shelter born from blueprints scribbled in haste and sweat-soaked ingenuity. Yet it ended as something far greater, a global symbol of endurance, adaptability, and human will. When the last gun fell silent, when the banners of nations fluttered over peace treaties instead of battlefields, those humble steel arches remained, not as relics of destruction, but as beacons of what humanity could achieve when survival and creativity fused together. Think of it. A hut that was never meant to last more than a few years has now outlived empires, presidents, and ideologies. Decades after the war, while concrete bunkers crumbled and barracks faded into dust, the Quonset stood proud against the wind, against rust, against time itself. In remote corners of the Pacific, where jungle vines have devoured tanks and runways, you can still find their curved silhouettes peeking through the foliage, quiet ghosts of an industrial age that refused to die. And yet each hut tells a different story. Some became chapels where soldiers prayed for home. Others turned into clinics where mothers gave birth to a new generation. Others into schools where the children of war learned peace. It's hard not to feel awe when you realize that a design meant for war helped rebuild the world it once helped destroy. Engineers called it efficient. Soldiers called it reliable. Survivors called it salvation. But time has revealed its true nature, not just as architecture but as philosophy. The Quonset taught the world that strength doesn't need to be complicated, that endurance can be beautiful in its simplicity. Its shape, that perfect half-arch, defied bombs and storms, but it also defied cynicism. It said without words that no matter what the world tears down, we will build again. Its corrugated skin may have been scarred by shrapnel, its bolts may have rusted, but its spirit, that audacious belief in renewal, still gleams beneath the layers of time. Even now, architects study its form, survivalists live beneath its roof, and veterans visit them like old friends, tracing their hands over the ridges of steel that once protected them from the chaos outside. A Quonset isn't just a building. It's a heartbeat frozen in metal, a reminder that progress can be born from pain and design can carry memory. Some say the modern world has moved past it, that skyscrapers and smart homes have replaced its simplicity, but they're wrong. Because every prefab shelter, every modular design, every emergency structure deployed after a disaster carries a little of the Quonset's DNA. The idea that something can be built quickly, shipped anywhere, assembled by anyone, and still stand against the fury of nature. That's not just a concept. That's a legacy. It's what the engineers at Quonset Point unknowingly gave us, the blueprint for resilience. And if you listen closely, in the quiet after a storm, or in the hum of a factory that's rebuilding after loss, you can almost hear it. The faint metallic echo of those curved walls singing in defiance. That song belongs to every soldier who slept under one in the rain, every refugee who made it a home, every child who studied by candlelight beneath its roof. That's the sound of humanity refusing to surrender. In a way, the Quonset story is our story, a testament that even when the world falls apart, we have within us the power to bend, not break. And maybe that's why, even today, as the world once again faces uncertainty, the image of a simple steel hut standing tall in the storm reminds us that ingenuity, compassion, and perseverance are the strongest materials ever forged. The Quonset hut didn't just survive history, it carried it, sheltered it, and taught it to endure. And somewhere right now, under a curved roof that hums softly in the wind, someone is safe, warm, alive, never realizing that the walls around them are more than steel. They are a promise kept by time itself.